Howdy folks, Scanner here. In this video I'm going to be showing you how I painted my Observer from Trench Crusade. So I guess it's been quite a while since I've done a painting video, so I'm somewhat out of practice, so bear with me. Over the coming weeks and months I will improve at this kind of thing. And I just went for a fairly dark, grimy, ugly ass style, which is what I'm going for on my Trench Crusade stuff. Kind of Zorn palette and metal really is where I'll be going, and this guy's mostly metal, so there's not a huge amount of Zorn palette to be found here. I started out with a zenithal highlight for absolutely no reason. As I said, he's mostly metal. He didn't need a zenithal highlight. He simply ended up in a bunch of other miniatures I was highlighting. There's a quick look at the anti-tank communicant, which would be another video at some point, but I kind of messed up a little bit the footage, so I'm gonna have to paint one of the alternatives for the video. Potentially, I'm not sure. Let's get stuck in. So I guess first things first, we'll talk about the actual metal recipe. I used Metal and Alchemy by Scale 75's Decayed Metal. It is the basis of my new favorite way to paint metal on any miniature in basically any system. I just really enjoy using it. I will probably do a full video about that process in and of itself. Yeah, so just the decayed metal as something of a base onto all the armor plate and the helmet. I also used it on the back of the shoulder guard and the sides, because I figured I'd be going with like a blood red on the front, and just having any kind of darker color on the back and sides would imply a degree of shadow once you go over them compared to the brightness of the front. It's not particularly complicated reasoning. True or not, it's what I was thinking. Up next, stage 2 of my new metal process, which involves Exhaust Manifold by Vallejo Metal Color. This is, I would say, my favorite, what I would classify as steel kind of colors. And what I do here is I just go over the chainmail. Obviously, it's a very nice alternate color to the armor plate with the decayed metal, and we're also going to use it there as well. Alrighty, so next stage, my favorite black, NATO Black by Model Air. This is just an incredibly dry black. Very matte once it actually dries, and looks fantastic. I love it for Trench Crusade because I'm a bit bored of these very slick, shiny blacks that have become the rigueur, I guess, and I like a dry matte kind of black, so I use this on the cloak, and I think it takes about 2 coats to fully cover the cloak to the degree that I want. Now, one thing that you're really going to pick up on pretty early is I learned to paint in the 80s, and I've painted and not painted in various spurts over that time. I do not consider myself to be like a great painter by any means. I feel I have an adequate tabletop standard. I do think I know a lot about painting because I pay attention. I've watched a lot of videos and stuff on painting, but I imagine that the style in which this video is recorded is going to infuriate some people, because I've noticed the common thing now is that people will work up an area almost completely. Like somebody would start with the cloak and do the cloak entirely and then move on to the next thing, and that's just not how my brain works at all. I need to patch in the colors in a very basic sense, so I understand what the model looks like in my head, and I understand the kind of values and brightness and contrast that I'm going to be working in with, and then I'm able to do it all from there. Because if I make the cloak super kind of contrasty, suddenly I have to, in my head, make the metals super contrasty, and I just don't think that's the case. So yeah, this is just how I paint, and I'm sorry if it pisses you off. I just, everything goes together slowly over time, much like my videos and my thoughts. And then for the shoulder guard, I just use Mephiston Red. I think it's one of the nicest reds available, just Games Workshop Mephiston Red. I think it's a beautiful color. It took about 3 layers to get it to the point where I was happy with how it looked, because I knew I was going to be doing some damage and some kind of battle scarring effect to it over time. So at this point, I basically have everything I want roughly filled in. I go at the handle of the spear and the shoes with just some browns, some pretty standard brown combos. I just go on with Rhinox Hide and Beastly Brown. Rhinox Hide from Games Workshop, and then Beastly Brown from Vallejo to bring up some details. I was trying to figure out if I was going to straighten the spear or not, and I decided I actually didn't want to, because it looks like it came like it's just a branch off a tree rather than an actual weapon. And I think that, I don't know, there's something interesting about that, like maybe it's from some holy tree or some shit, I don't know. But yeah, there's the basics. We've now essentially, I'm at ground zero as far as painting goes. I can now, in my head, actually start thinking about the painting. Alrighty, so what I do now is I go back to the armor as the main component, and I start using the exhaust manifold to just put in little highlights onto the armor, onto the areas of decayed metal, just on the sharpest edges. They get a little bit of the exhaust manifold color on there to act as a highlight. Why? Because it's a nice highlight without being brighter than everything else on the model. It's essentially the brightest metal color on the model, so that's what I'm using. I then do some like downward scraping and stroking, and it almost like a very gentle dry brushing to get some buildup on some of the heightened areas. Because if you look at the concept art for the Observer, it looks like the armor is very much kind of made out of almost like a rough, poorly adhering alloy of assorted metal types, and I wanted that effect, and I wanted a kind of a combination of some griminess and stuff without having to resort to oils or enamel washes and things of that nature. I just like to be able to just paint it onto the model. Like, I love those techniques, I really do, but I'm kind of interested in having these Trench Crusade models appear quite dry, worn but not dirty in a way, mid-campaign, but still finding the time to, you know, wash off their armor of the gore and ichor between, but not necessarily the damage. So I go around to kind of any surface area that I want, and I start adding a little bit of the exhaust manifold to it. That includes the shoulder piece, just adding in some damage and just very slowly building up layers over time. I'm a person who believes in layers and how those layers look. As I said, I don't think I'm a great painter by any means. I'm not, there's no complicated process in what I can do or what I'm able to do. I do very simple things because my hands, I've got some issues with my hands, and they demand simplicity basically to be able to adequately work. You're never going to see me doing like hugely complicated, you know, Marco Frazzoni style blends and things of that nature. It's just outside of the scope of what my hands will do, so I do what I can. So I get about 40% coverage, I would guess, of the exhaust manifold. Very light between highlights, certain just like points picking out, a little bit of dry brushing on flatter surfaces, just to kind of, I call it conflicting the color. You're not really sure what the original intent was, and you go from there. I think that's how you make a good patinaed metal, and we'll be back to that in a moment. For now, we're going on to the cloak. As I said, I paint in the most scatterbrained way. So we're going on to the cloak. I take the NATO black, I take some Vallejo khaki, and I mix some in. I like to use khaki instead of another gray or a blue for a lot of my black highlights. I just think it looks nicer. And I start very carefully and gently building up a variety of shapes onto the raised surfaces. So I start with a stippling brush. It's not instantly impactful, and it's not really meant to be. I've also noticed you definitely can't pick it up too well on this camera that I'm using, but I'll be getting a different recording setup going over the coming weeks and months, I guess. I'm just using like a document camera now, which I find to be very, very useful. So I just start building up a variety of shapes. What I like to do with this kind of thing, because I just think it's not about what you paint, it's about what your eye perceives. And nothing ever has wear and tear in a neat way. Nothing is ever all lines. Nothing is ever all circles, all triangles, etc. Things are, you know, geometry is made up by very complex shapes. I guess very simple shapes overlaid in very complex ways. And that's what I try to do. So I just go over with a stipple brush on a very, very, very faint uptick from the color of the NATO brown. And this is just kind of designed to almost give me a way to know what I want to do. I'm seeing the highlights kind of forming in front of me, and I'm getting to grips with what the cloak is going to end up looking like. So I have a bunch of stippled dots, and then I break out a small brush and I start working in lines. They conflict with each other, they cross over each other. As I said, I alternate the directions that things are going in from time to time, and I'm just building up on the raised areas very slowly, going up through my khaki mix, kind of trying to be as subtle as I can possibly be, and honestly being willing to spend the time to just put on layers that, like, better painters wouldn't have to take the time to do it, and I'm well aware of that. They can just do things like probably much more efficiently and much faster. This is not teaching you by any means how to do a black cloak. This is just what somebody who's an idiot like me does. So I slowly build up and just work my whole way through till I get to a point, to a highlight effectively, that I'm quite happy with. Now, an important note here is that I might even push the highlight past where I'm comfortable. I might make it look a little brighter, almost too bright, because I'm going to be coming back to it with some filter, and I'm going to be going at it all over again, because as I said, I'm willing to just, when you don't have the skill, it makes sense to find a technique that works for you and then just be patient with that. And you can see things starting to get quite bright now. Almost, I would argue, too bright, almost to the point of cartooniness, because the contrast is way too high and the color differential between the black and the highlight is way too high. But that's actually what I want, because the filters are really going to dim that down. And as I said, because most of how our eyes perceive things is somewhat illusory and our brain fills in a lot, I like to just go over with a extremely light dry brush. Why? Because it's adding yet another conflicting shape into the whole mix that your eye is trying to make sense of. And we're talking about old, wrecked, dirty cloth here. It's not a thing that you know, follows sensible pattern. Now, what kind of magic are we doing for our filter? Really simple, watered down NATO black. That's it. Just use water. Don't use any kind of medium. A medium is highly likely to contain some kind of substance which will be somehow glossy. And that's not what I want, because if I go over it with this, it will once again dry pretty matte. And there is a little bit of glossiness about to come its way, and I do not want to amplify that in any way. But I just go over with a very thin, very watered down NATO black, and it just kind of smudges everything a little closer together. It is an intensely useful thing to do when you're trying to paint these cloaks, and it cuts the highs from as high as they were which is why I pushed them just a little bit beyond where I would have been comfortable. Alrighty, so this is where we are at this stage in the process. I think this is looking pretty nice. I've added some hoplite gold to the shoulder detail. I really want the detail to pop. Don't worry about the fact that the hand is white. I've actually done that for a reason. I've just added some hoplite gold to the shoulder detail, and that's it. So basically this is where we are, and you'd be happy enough to call that done, but for whatever reason I drag it out even more. I've also added some jade to the eyes. There's a beautiful color by Vallejo, just this jade green, that I love doing for that kind of stuff. It's not a traditional green, and it's not just a simple blue or red, and it just works with everything. So the next step will be to add what is called marine juice to the entire miniature. I go over all the metals, the cloak, the shoes, the spear, the whole show with this one wash. If you're interested in what marine juice is, there'll be a link in the description below to a Sonic Sledgehammer video where he talks about it. It's something that he came up with. I take no credit for it whatsoever. Go watch his video, listen to his reasoning for his recipe. I have found it to be tremendously beneficial. My preferred wash when I want to just kind of bring everything back a step and tie it all in together. I just think it does a tremendous job, and it's a very important part of how I achieved my finished look. So thank you very much to Sonic Sledgehammer for marine juice. I personally find it to be incredibly useful. And once I've got the marine juice done, I mix a little bit of Black Lotus by Vallejo and I water it down, and I just work it in at the very bottom. Whilst the marine juice is still wet, I kind of blend it into the very bottom of the chainmail to add a lot of shadow. Probably about 50-50 Black Lotus, and I just mixed it with water, like it's going straight into marine juice. It's not, there's no point in using a medium and worrying about it or anything like that. This is not a delicate process. Alrighty, so when the marine juice dries, the armor is going to be pulled back quite a lot. You can see it's starting to look really kind of iffy now. I would argue it's almost a little too dark. So we're going to repeat basically the process of absolutely anything. Everything that we covered, we're going to cover about 45% of that 45% with, we're going to go back over with decayed metal again on certain edges and certain flats and certain panels. We're going to go back over again with exhaust manifold on kind of smaller highlights. And we're also going to add some game color hammered copper. And what we're going to do here is we're going to very indelicately pick out kind of 7 or 8 points on the armor and really make them pop just a little bit. My reasoning for this, I think it's better to have a thematic reason to paint something than a technical reason to paint something, so bear with me. So I'm thinking, if I'm an observer and the lore of the observer is that, like, they see through the eyes of God, and as long as they focus they can kind of see what's coming. To me, that doesn't mean dodging things, that means getting hit by things in the right place. So your armor is going to get like dinged a little bit, but you're always taking it in a place that can survive the shot. I don't know if many people watching this have any kind of history of kind of combat sports, but sometimes you're just shelling up and you're taking a shot that comes in because the trade in return is what's really going to matter. If you put in so much energy that you're always dodging absolutely everything all the time, with the exception of very rare boxers from time to time, people like Floyd Mayweather and whatnot, you're going to be expending a lot of energy. So this guy's in a battle, he will do the bare minimum basically to avoid death, and sometimes that will just mean turning things off his armor. So some weird discoloration in different places to imply taking heavy shots. It just adds, I think, to the visual interest of the model, and it helps build up that overall patina that we're going for. So once again, we go back over with decayed metal some, we go back over with exhaust manifold on some highlights, and we work in some of this burnished copper to really kind of pick out some heavy points where it just makes you think, oh look, something happened to the armor in that location. After that, we get stuck back in on just the little blade. We do the same thing. We just make it kind of sharp and shiny in certain places. You can see the marine juice kind of took care of the hand for me, which is pretty nice of it, and I appreciate that. Thank you, marine juice. And I just go to the chainmail and I do a little bit of highlighting down because it just works quite nicely. It meets the kind of lotus coming from the bottom with the pure exhaust manifold coming down through the mix of marine juice. It just adds a nice gradient, and it's cheap and easy to do. Like the one thing I would argue on the model that looks good is that. So back to the shoulder guard to work up a little bit more Mephiston red. I don't like how dull it all is after the marine juice, and I want more of that kind of contrast and more of that color. I want it to look like it's been taking a beating. Like, once again, the Observer has been choosing to take the shots there where it made sense to do so, because that's literally what they're for. So at some point I smashed a bit of green stuff into the hole in the base, and I broke out my two easy basing materials, which are Vallejo Thick Mud, the black mud version, and Vallejo Thick Mud, the Russian mud version. At some point I saw a Sam Lenz video, and he was talking about you should have the rear of your base just be darker than the front of your base, and that just kind of stuck with me as something that did make a lot of sense in my head. So the rear of the base gets the black mud, and the front of the base gets the Russian mud, which is just a little bit lighter, and then I kind of blend them together as best I can. And then the last thing to happen to this guy was that the jade got a little speck of white around the eyes. I let that dry, and then I went over with the Waywatcher green glaze, and it's just a cheap and easy way to get some kind of visual interest rolling in there. And you just like dab it on with a little blob of it so that it kind of sits on top, and it doesn't look like it's going to be very green, but if you trust the process and just let it dry, it does actually go nice and green. And there you go, my painted Observer from the initial Trench Crusade Kickstarter. That's how I did what I did. I'm always more interested in why people did what they did, so I kind of focused in on my reasoning and my thoughts. If you have any, like, this was a long ass video. Basically all my videos are long ass videos. I've been that way my entire time on YouTube basically. So hopefully you got something from it, or you just enjoyed it, or you were sitting there listening to me just talk cat shit whilst you were painting something yourself. That's when I'm watching most of the painting videos that I watch. And yeah, I'll get better at these over time. I hope I'll have more on the way, specifically around Trench Crusade, and very much not about Trench Crusade. As I said, I will do a kind of an in-depth metal recipe, because it's so easily scalable depending on what I want to do. I just kind of emphasize one of the colors or the other. It makes life very simple. And yeah, that's that. So as I said, I don't consider myself to be a very good painter. I consider myself to be adequate to a tabletop standard. I can make stuff look pretty interesting, but I do have the best piece of advice that you're ever going to get ever when it comes to trying to improve at painting, and that's just practice. At the points in my life where I practiced, I got better, and when I wasn't practicing, I did not get better. And it's no more complicated than that. There's no paint or technique or anything in the world that will improve your painting more than simply painting your next miniature. That's it. Just practice, learn, practice, learn, practice, learn, end. So yes, thank you as always for watching. There's a lot more lore stuff coming. I'm getting more and more comfortable with the idea of writing my own kind of chunks of this and that. Lots of stuff coming to the channel over the coming weeks.